Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, dubious speculation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, over the last couple of weeks, we talked about Bitcoin holding support at the bull market support band. And following that, likely, obviously nothing was a guarantee, but likely rallying starting in about mid-October to approximately 67 to 68K, right? We talked about that a lot. And the reason why I said 67 to 68 was because I pulled out my tea leaves and I noticed that if you connect the dots on the lower high structure over here, that's where it took Bitcoin, right? Um, and you could argue that there's a little bit of you know, wiggle room, right? There's a little bit of wiggle room, flexibility, if you will, on the lower high structure. You could easily take this up a little bit and it still be in line with that lower high structure. And so it's possible that Bitcoin could still go up from here a little bit and still maintain the lower high structure. But that's not why you're here, right? I don't think a lot of you guys are interested. And I said this yesterday when we put out the video yesterday. I said, guys, no one cares if Bitcoin's at 62K, 64K, 66, or 68K, right? It's all the same to some degree. It's the same price Bitcoin's been at for the last 6 months, last 7 months. And so, I think at this point, if we're all being honest with ourselves, both sides of the market should be fairly exhausted, whether you're a bull or a bear. Because while the market has trended down, it's been a very slow process. And we also saw something very similar happen last cycle, right? A very similar move in 2019. Now, the 2019 fractal, just taking place over 6 months, already ended, right? That already ended, and I mentioned that a number of times. The only other thing left in the short term to figure out is, do we get a landing or not? Now, again, you can actually get a soft landing, and then maybe you get a hard landing later on, right? I'm not that opposed to that idea, sort of a soft landing late 2024 and then maybe a hard landing in 2026. That's always a possibility. But in the short term, what is Bitcoin going to focus on now, right? What's it going to focus on? And that's what I've been talking about for a while, is that Bitcoin would likely make its way to the top of this, to this lower high structure by mid to late October. To be completely honest, I'm surprised it got there this quickly, right? I mean, I thought you might get another consolidation week where it slightly goes up, and then next week could have been the week that took us to the lower high structure. I mean, if you look back over here in 2023, the mid October was a green week, but it was the following week that really blasted through. If you go look at 2019, it was the week of October 21st where Bitcoin had a big move up, and so on and so forth, right? You could take that back and look at pretty similar stuff, but nevertheless, right, it made it there. It doesn't really matter if it makes it there this week, doesn't really make it matter if it makes it there next week. It made it there nonetheless, right? And if you look back at every time Bitcoin has put in a lower high, it made it up there sort of the middle to late part of the month, right? It got up here mid-July and then slowly went up into the end of July and then sold off, right? And then over here in May, it started going up in mid-May, got up here the week of May 20th, continued to stay up there until the early part of June. And then if you go back again, right, it moved up. This is sort of mid-March, late March, and then it wicked up early April and then sold off, right? So the pattern is go up into the middle part of a month, hang out in that region until the end of the month, and then make your decision, right? Then Bitcoin will make its decision on whether it's going to be another lower high or finally a breakout, right? Now, why? Again, why has Bitcoin been putting in lower highs? And I talked about this yesterday. The S&P has just been going up for the last half year. And Bitcoin keeps concerning itself with things that the S&P isn't really concerning itself with. And I think the reason, as I've said, is that Bitcoin is further along the risk curve than the S&P. But even that is not an entirely fair assessment, because if you measure Bitcoin from the low, before the lower highs began, it rallied almost 400%, whereas the S&P only rallied like 50 or 60%. So even though Bitcoin has experienced lower highs as measured from the bottom, it's still far above the S&P. But if you measure it from the 2021 top, it's more in line with the S&P. So it all depends on what your reference point is, right? If you want to measure it from the low, Bitcoin's outperformed the S&P. If you want to measure it from the high, as of yesterday, the S&P had slightly outperformed Bitcoin, but given the most recent move by Bitcoin, it might be getting closer to even, right? So when we look at a chart like this, we must ask ourselves, what changed in March, right? What changed in March? Because before that, we had a hell of a lot of momentum going on. So what changed in March? And the answer to that question is really three things that we've talked about basically all year long, right? And I know it's repetitive, and I know it's boring, and I'm not asking you to trade based on this information. My view is just DCA Bitcoin at low enough risk levels and forget about the rest, right? The rest is noise. Who really cares? 10 years from now, no one's going to care about this range anyways. Probably 2 years from now, no one's going to care about it. But what I think we have to look at, the first thing we have to look at is what changed starting in March. Well, in March, that is what marked sort of the low, the short-term low for the unemployment rate, right? You can see it pulled back into March right here. That was the March candle. It pulled back into March. And then that is where Bitcoin found that top. Because after that, the unemployment rate continued to go up, right? About 0.1% every month. And then there was a 0.2% jump. And every single time it continued to go up, Bitcoin kept getting rejected off of the lower high structure. Now, over the last 2 months, Bitcoin has been rallying from the low in August, but also the unemployment rate has been going down. So the market is going to be interested in primarily this question, right? Primarily this question. And I think most other things are not going to matter. You might say, well, Ben, the election matters, right? And I'm not going to say that election results don't have any impact on markets. They do. But I will say this, Bitcoin has done well under both administrations, right? Whether it be Democrats or Republicans, which is a good thing, right? It's a good thing that Bitcoin's success is not tied to political outcomes, right? And Bitcoin has proven that because it's been around for, it was created back in it launched in early 2009. And, essentially since then, we've had both Democratic presidents and Republican presidents, and Bitcoin went up either way, right? Which is good news for all of us, crypto degens, right? I mean, that's good news, is that we don't have to be reliant on who wins that. But the bigger concern, right, the thing that actually matters is the unemployment rate, right? That is what's mattered since March. So what I think is that Bitcoin, and I will be very quick to pivot if this view is wrong, okay? My guess is that as we go into the election season, and the election season, but as we actually get into the election, and as we get closer to November 1st, which is when the unemployment rate number is going to come out, I'm guessing that the momentum will wane a little bit because the market's going to want to know what happens, right? The market's going to want to know what happens. Is this move by the unemployment rate recently, is it the start of a new trend, right? Is this the start of a new trend? Or is it just part of a larger stochastic process higher, right? Or is it down? That's what the market cares about, right? There's 1,000 other things that we can look at and pretend like that's what the market cares about. But this is really what the market, I think, cares about, is what happens at the November print for unemployment, okay? And that, I think, will dictate what happens to Bitcoin for the rest of the quarter. If the unemployment rate comes in low, then it would make sense that Bitcoin should then be able to break through the lower high structure just as it did in 2019 after about 7 months, which is precisely where we are right now, right? You know, this was about 7 months in and it broke through. And you could argue that if the unemployment rate can drop, then it should break through. You can see over here, the unemployment rate, it went up a little, it flatlined, and then it started to go down, and then the unemployment rate broke through. Then, of course, the unemployment rate shot up, and then that's where Bitcoin came back down to test that lower trend line one last time. Okay, so in this case, what's going to happen, right? What's going to happen with the labor market? Is it going to surprise us to the upside or the downside, right? Is it going to just go back down or will it continue higher? If it goes down, then the odds are more favorable that Bitcoin would break through the lower high structure. And furthermore, it would likely help it stay on pace with the prior cycles when you measure the ROI of Bitcoin from the low. Because as I said, this is normally the time that Bitcoin would start moving up as measured from the low. Furthermore, if you look at year-to-date ROI for Bitcoin in halving years, it's always moved up in Q4, right? So to say it's going to go down is betting against that seasonality. The only real thing, other than say some major geopolitical thing that's not worth concerning ourselves about because it's impossible to predict that stuff, the only thing that could really throw this off course would be a bad unemployment rate print, in my view, right? That's the only thing. It's the same way like how traditional markets, they normally do well unless there's a real reason for them not to do well. And we've seen that happen time and time again, right? Markets don't need a reason to go up. They need a reason to go down. And the only reason that is worth considering, in my view, is the labor market. So, if the labor market comes in okay, then it's more likely that we just follow that 2019 pattern or the Q4 prior halving year pattern, and we see Bitcoin continue to go up in Q4 and break through this lower high structure, right? If, on the other hand, it doesn't and it shoots back up, then it's more likely that it gets rejected again. And I'm just trying to be honest, right? That's just my view. And, you know, these views have been criticized all year, but so far it has been lower highs all year. Now, one of the reasons why I think that Bitcoin might consolidate a little bit before deciding is because the labor market data and the election stuff is still 2 to 3 weeks away, right? And also, every single time we saw Bitcoin get up into this range, it's always then hung out here for at least a little bit, right? It doesn't just immediately go all the way back down. Now, that doesn't mean it can't go back down to like 63K. Maybe it even goes all the way back down to the 20-week SMA or something. I don't know. And this ends up just being a wick in the short term. But that is a consideration. Now, why else, besides the unemployment rate, why else did Bitcoin put in that sort of that mid-cycle top, if you want to call it that, in March? Well, again, as I've said, that was also when gold broke out, right? I mean, and when gold broke out in 2019, it marked the mid-cycle top, right? The quantitative tightening phase of the top that occurred during the quantitative tightening phase, right? If you look at gold last cycle and you look to see when it broke out, that basically marked the sort of mid-cycle top for Bitcoin, the top that occurred during quantitative tightening and high rates. and then it bled until the last rate cut, right? Same thing happened this cycle. Let's not overcomplicate things. Mid-cycle top when gold broke out during QT. Both rallies, by the way, in last cycle and this cycle were about 350% for Bitcoin. Isn't that fascinating? And both about 300% or so. I think it was like 350. Around like 350 or so for both of these rallies as measured from when they started to when it actually topped. Fascinating. Right? Fascinating because it's basically the same thing. The other thing to think about too, and I've sort of talked about this a little bit before, is instead of measuring this move and overlaying it with this whole thing, right? Instead of like taking it like this, and let me get the whole thing. Instead of taking it like this and then starting it here, right? Which is probably what a lot of people would want to do. No, that doesn't actually make the most amount of sense. The reason is because that rally that occurred right here, it was sort of a sell-off as the Fed paused rates, and then it took off, right? So let's compare that to that, right? So instead of overlaying this with this, we have to put it over here where the Fed actually paused. And there you see a much more compelling view, right? It lines up a lot better. You see? Now, I sure as hell don't know if we're going to get a landing immediately in Q4. Again, it would be going against the momentum, and it's dangerous to fade the momentum. I've learned that many times. But this is an important view to have in your back pocket to say, if somehow Bitcoin can still not break through after all this time, is it any different than last cycle? No, right? Because even last cycle, there was a landing, right? So there could be a landing this cycle before the market gets back on track, right? There could be. And one of the things I've said before is that after Bitcoin dominance reaches 60%, there should be, I think, one final sell-off. Now, whether that sell-off is just backtesting this trend line or coming all the way back down here again, that's going to be dependent on the labor market data, right? Whether it comes all the way back down here or if it goes up and then it's just backtesting it, and that's the sell-off, right? But either way, I think after Bitcoin dominance hits 60%, there should be one final drop in the market. And the reason I say that is because last cycle, there was a sell-off after Bitcoin dominance topped, right? In the QT phase of the cycle, right? Dominance topped here, and then there was this sell-off right here that took us back down to the 100-week moving average. And then, yes, we had a hard landing. And we could, honestly, there's a good chance that we will get a hard landing, but it could still be a year away, right? I mean, sometimes even after the uninversion of the yield curve, the actual landing part of it doesn't occur until 6 to 12 months later. So you could have a scenario where you do get a bear market, a pretty brutal bear market, but maybe doesn't come until 2026 when it always comes, right? In the midterm year, 2014, 2018, 2022, and perhaps 2026. The other thing to think about, besides gold breaking out back then, and besides the unemployment rate, the other thing to think about is the other metric we discussed over and over and over again, and you guys know what it was and what it is. It is USDT dominance. And the reason why we look at this is because every time Bitcoin tagged this trend line, there was a larger correction. So back in March, when everyone was screaming 100K at you and dunking on any view that called for a lower high structure for 6 to 9 months, where are they now, right? Where are they now? Probably just saying the same old thing, right? Just repeating the same old tired lines, and that's about it. If you look at USDT dominance, every time it tagged the trend line, it resulted in a larger correction by Bitcoin. And it tagged it in March. And ever since then, it's been holding this lower time frame trend line, right? Rather than this larger trend line, it's been moving up on this trend line, which is where it is, where it just went a few hours ago. So, if USDT dominance holds support on the trend line, then the resistance level, the lower high structure of USDT dominance that's been developing since 2022 would actually put it, let's just say it happens by December, would actually put it right around 7%. So keep that number in the back of your mind. 7%. Doesn't have to happen, right? Let's hope that Bitcoin can get through the lower high structure and all systems are go. And we don't have to worry about the unemployment numbers and the unemployment numbers coming low. Let's hope. Hope for the best, plan for the worst. Bitcoin heavy crypto portfolio over here until dominance is 60%. And I've been telling you guys that for years. It's okay to consider the downside risk and still maintain a position. Because guess what? The only reason alts will go up from here is if Bitcoin goes up first. And the reason alts will go down from here is if either Bitcoin goes sideways or Bitcoin goes down, right? Either one could send altcoins lower. So watch that trend line. And it's because of this trend line, that's the reason why Bitcoin might wane a little bit in terms of its momentum going into the election, going into the labor market results. You see? So, I still think that this whole year has been sort of a learning process for everyone because, every time Bitcoin rallies, we all get excited. And then every time it dumps, everyone's like, oh, great, recession's immediate. And then it keeps not being either, right? It keeps not being either. The only thing I think about the unemployment rate that I'm a little concerned about right now, because previously it was really starting to trend down, right? It was, and it still very well could be. But the only thing that has me a little concerned about it is initial claims tend to be a pretty good indicator for the unemployment rate, right? So, and if you look at initial claims, they're starting to move up. Obviously, some of that is because of Hurricane Helene in North Carolina. If you look at the initial claims normalized by population map, you can see that North Carolina is in fact one of the states that, initial claims normalized by population is at 0.11%, whereas just a month ago in North Carolina, it was at 0.03%. But if you look back at all these prior times, October, this is what it looked like October 2022, and then here's what it looked like by December, right? A lot of it picked up. Initial claims picked up going into the year. And then if you look at October of 2023, it looked like that, and then by the end of the year, it looked like that. And then now it's already October looking like this. What's it going to look like by December? And yes, the North Carolina could just be a one-off spike, but we're probably going to see another spike coming from Florida because of Hurricane Milton. Furthermore, you do have some spikes over here in Michigan, Washington, and Oregon that weren't there a few weeks ago, right? So what's going on over there? If you overlay initial claims with the unemployment rate, you can see pretty clearly that they somewhat track each other. And this orange line, you can see initial claims has moved back up here, right? You see that? You see how initial claims is starting to move up. Like it also was dropping commensurate with the unemployment rate, but now the initial claims are going back up. So does that imply that the unemployment rate is going to go back up in November? Because if it does, and Bitcoin painfully puts in another lower high, and then it goes back down to the bottom of the trend line again, well, that should be sufficient to take ETH home, right? Which is exactly what it, what it did in 2019. You see how in Sorry, I don't know why I clicked on the liquidity logarithmic regression band. Q4 2016, Q4 2019, Q4 2024. All years where ETH Bitcoin broke down. All years where ETH USD dropped in November and December. In 2016, ETH dropped October, November, December, but in 2019, October was actually a slightly green month for ETH, and so was September. And I've said many, many times, I think 2024 for ETH is a mix of 2019 and 2016. Every monthly candle so far has in 2016 that was green has been green in 2024, and every red candle in 2016 has been red in 2024. If October ends up being red, it'll still be a carbon copy of 2016. If it ends up being green, it'll still kind of look like what happened right here in 2019, where there were 2 green monthly candles just below the bull market support band, just like we're seeing right now. But then November, December, we're still red. So I still go back to that view that ETH could drop November, December timeframe, and it might be on the back of a bad labor market print, and it could be on the back of the uninversion of the 3-month and the 10-year yield. The counterpoint to all this is that doesn't mean that Bitcoin has to go down, right? It does not mean that. And I've said this many, many times. In Q4 of 2016, Bitcoin went up while ETH went down. It seems like a far-fetched scenario to consider because their correlation coefficients have been pretty high recently, but it's not something you should completely dismiss. It is true that in 2016, Bitcoin was putting in higher lows throughout that process, whereas in 2024, it's been putting in lower lows. More similar to 2019 than 2016. So, how do you plan, right? Again, I think Bitcoin dominance is the key. It's the secret. It's the key to unlocking the secrets of the cryptoverse. You just stay Bitcoin heavy until dominance is much higher because no one knows, what's going to happen to the USD valuations of these things, right? And at least Bitcoin gives you exposure to the market. It's not like you just want to sit around and twiddle your thumbs for years and years and years and not have any exposure. Bitcoin gives you exposure to the upside, but it minimizes your downside risk. So if there is a drop, so what, right? I mean, Bitcoin will still probably recover from it. Whereas every time Bitcoin has dropped, a lot of the altcoins just keep going lower, right? I mean, again, Bitcoin is the same price that it has been all year, basically, whereas Ethereum has so slowly marched down. And the altcoin market as a whole has more so slowly marched down than Bitcoin has. So that's the speculation, right? That's the dubious speculation that I think there is a case to be made that the momentum for Bitcoin, while it could still continue in the very short term, I think it might stall out slightly before the November labor market print and the election results, and wait to see what happens before deciding. That is what I think is the most likely outcome. In the short term, Bitcoin has already tested lower high structure. If you want to get a little bit more liberal with the way you draw the line, you could say, well, maybe it could go a little bit higher. What it did last time, what it did in 2019 was it actually broke the lower high structure and went back up to the prior high, the prior lower high, which if it did that this time, you know what it would correspond to? 70K, right? 70K. So it would correspond to doing something like this, where it kind of hangs out, goes up there, and then we figure out what happens, right? So there's a chance that happens. But I would say this, in order for that to happen, you would more than likely, you would see altcoins take a hit. That would allow USDT dominance to hold the trend line, but for that capital to just rotate into Bitcoin. And the great example of that is what's going on today. Bitcoin's up 0.5%, but a lot of these alts are down, right? Doge is down 3%, ETH is down almost 2%, XRP down 1.5%, ADA down 1.5%, Avalanche down 2.6%. Some of them are slightly up, but a lot of them are down. It's that rotation of capital that allows USDT dominance to continue to hold the trend line even while Bitcoin has gone higher. So 67 to 68K has been reached. That's what we said was the most likely outcome going into mid to late October. It's been reached. It's possible that Bitcoin could go higher than that. I would say even as high as I said yesterday, like it's possible it could even go as high as 70K before really figuring out where the next momentum and narrative is going to come from, right? But it's important to recognize that a lot of the trends we've been talking about this year have been playing out, but because they play out over a long period of time, it feels like they're not, right? But then you look back and you're like, oh, all this time he's been talking about Bitcoin dominance going to 60%, and it always felt like it wasn't. And then you look back on it many years later and you're like, it was never really not, right? It's just been going up for 3 years straight, basically. So those are my views, right? Those are my views on the market. I hope they're well articulated. And again, I think a lot of it's just going to come down to the labor market. If the labor market gives us a good print in November, then Bitcoin should be able to go higher. If it gives us a bad print in November, then I would say watch out below. And you likely get one final sell-off before we pick back up again. Again, the 2019 comparison is over, right? In terms of this lower high, that the 6-month process is played out. The reason I said 6 to 9 months is because the landing occurred 3 months after the 2019 structure was over, right? And 3 months after, if you take it as August, September, October, November, or if you take it as September, that would put you in December, which would be fascinating if it played out like that. If Bitcoin did get another sell-off in November, December, everyone freaks out thinking that, there's some major recession here, and then it just ends up being another local bottom before then going up. A lot of times Bitcoin will sort of have a sell-off about 1 year before a major market cycle top, right? Like this was March 2020, and then this was March 2021. So, yeah, just something to think about. And so, yeah, we'll see if that plays out. If it doesn't, if there's not a sell-off and the unemployment rate comes in soft and it's like, all right, well, maybe the labor market isn't so bad, then what I would expect would be to break through the lower high structure, to maybe back test it on say the December print, and then to continue going higher into 2025. So those are the two most likely outcomes, I would say. And I'm not asking you to trade any of that. I'm not. I've just stuck with Bitcoin for the last 3 years, and it's been honestly pretty easy. And I've said many times, this is the easiest part of the cycle, right? You just stay Bitcoin heavy and you ignore everything else. But anyways, that'll wrap it up for me. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. We'll see you guys next time. Bye.